Very worried we are about Sian. She's been missing now for over 2 days, and it's not like her not to come home or contact any of us for such a long time. We all want to know where Sian is, and we want her home safe and well.
Swindon, England, March 2011. At 2:52 in the morning, Sian O'Callaghan did something she had done dozens of times before. She said goodnight to her friends, pulled her coat a little tighter against the March cold, and stepped out onto the pavement to walk home. The night was quiet. The kind of quiet that only exists in the small hours when a town has finally stopped pretending to be awake. A few distant headlights. The faint thud of music bleeding through the club door behind her. The click of her heels on wet stone. Home was half a mile away. A 10-minute walk, maybe less. Through streets she had grown up on. Past shops she had visited since childhood. Along pavements she could have navigated with her eyes closed. She had her phone. She knew the route. She had done this before. Nobody who loved her was worried yet. That would change in a few hours. And when it did, it would change everything. To understand what happened to Sian O'Callaghan, you first have to understand who she was. Because this wasn't a story about someone living recklessly or someone who had slipped through the cracks. This was someone who had everything quietly going right. Sian Emma O'Callaghan was 22 years old. Born on the 3rd of June, 1988, she had spent her entire life in Swindon, Wiltshire, a town in the south of England that moves at its own unhurried pace. Not the kind of place that appears in headlines. Not the kind of place where people lock their doors twice or glance over their shoulders on the walk home. Swindon was ordinary in the best sense of the word. Familiar, predictable, safe. Sian fit her town perfectly. She wasn't loud. She didn't seek attention or drama. She had a soft sense of humor that came out in small ways. A well-timed comment, a look shared across a room, and a calmness about her that people noticed without always being able to explain. When things got tense around her, Sian had a way of steadying the atmosphere simply by being present. Friends described her as a great listener. Someone who made you feel heard without making a performance of it. But it was at home where that quality mattered most. When her parents separated, Sian was still a teenager. Rather than withdrawing or struggling, she stepped forward. She helped her mother Elaine manage the household. She kept an eye on her younger siblings, Lyanna, Laura, and the youngest, Aidan. She made sure the smaller ones got to school on time, that homework was done, that nobody felt the absence of stability too sharply. Aidan was the one who said it most plainly. He didn't call her his sister. He called her his second mom. She was the one who stayed up with him on the nights he couldn't sleep. The one who sat at the edge of his bed and kept the dark from feeling so heavy. She never made it a burden. It was simply what she did, because it needed doing and she was there. At work, the pattern repeated itself. After deciding that university wasn't the right path for her, Sian took an administrative role at a local business and made herself indispensable within months. She was the first in and among the last to leave. Her desk was tidy and purposeful, decorated with only one personal touch, a small handwritten sign that read "Keep Smiling." Her colleagues said it wasn't aspirational. It was just accurate. That was genuinely how she moved through the world. Her boyfriend Kevin Reap was 26, an IT professional with a steady job and a steady temperament. They had been together long enough that the relationship had settled into something comfortable and real. They shared an apartment just outside the town center. Friday evenings at home. Weekend trips to the coast when the weather allowed. Sunday dinners with family. The kind of life that doesn't make for dramatic stories, but makes for genuine happiness. Kevin would later describe those weeks before March as completely normal. No arguments, no tension, nothing that snagged at him or made him pause. In hindsight, that normalcy was almost the most painful part, because there was no warning, no moment where someone could look back and say, "There, that was the sign." That was when things started to shift. Sian's life in early 2011 was simply her life, steady and full and entirely ordinary. And then, between one moment and the next, it was gone. Friday the 18th of March, 2011 began the way most Fridays did. The working week wound down. Plans were made. Messages exchanged in group chats. The usual question that passes between friends at the end of every week. Are we going out tonight? The answer that Friday was yes. Sian got ready at the apartment she shared with Kevin. Nothing unusual about the evening. She wasn't celebrating anything, wasn't marking an occasion. It was simply Friday, and her friends were going to Fulture, a popular nightclub in the center of Swindon, and she was going with them. Kevin stayed home. He wasn't much for nightclubs. They kissed goodbye and she headed out, meeting the others before making their way into town together. CCTV footage from Fulture's entrance shows the group arriving just before midnight. If you were to watch that footage, and investigators would later watch it many times, you would see nothing that concerned you. A group of young women arriving for a night out. Sian among them, coat over her arm, laughing at something as she steps through the door. Inside, the night unfolded the way those nights do. Music loud enough to feel in your chest. Dancing. Conversations held at close range over the noise. The particular kind of ease that exists between a group of friends who know each other well enough to not need to perform. Those who were with Sian that night were consistent when they spoke to investigators later. She was herself, relaxed, happy. There was no argument, no tension with anyone inside the club, no moment that stood out as strange or uncomfortable. She danced. She laughed. She was simply there, fully and completely, in the way that she always was. At some point after 2 a.m., the group began to wind down. At 2:52 a.m., Sian decided to head home. She wasn't the last to leave. She wasn't being impulsive. She was tired and home was close, and the decision made complete sense. She hugged her friends, told them not to worry, and stepped out through the door and into the night. The pavement outside was wet. The streets were largely empty at that hour. A few taxis idled at the rank nearby. A distant streetlight cast a pale orange wash across the road. Sian turned in the direction of home and started walking. CCTV cameras mounted along the route captured her on the pavement. Her pace was calm and even. She wasn't rushing. There was nothing in how she moved to suggest anything other than a young woman making her way home at the end of a Friday night. Then she turned a corner, and the next camera in the sequence showed an empty street. Kevin woke somewhere around 3 a.m. He wasn't sure what had stirred him. A sound outside, maybe, or just the unconscious awareness that the space beside him was still empty. He reached for his phone and checked the time, then typed a quick message. "You on your way?" He set the phone down and waited for the screen to light up with a reply. It didn't. He called. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. He left a short message, casual, not worried, and told himself she had probably stayed out a bit later and lost track of time. Maybe her battery had died. Maybe the music was too loud to hear it ring. He went back to sleep. At 7 a.m., he woke again and the bed was still empty. He called immediately this time. Voicemail again. He called her friends, one by one, working through the group. The answers were all the same. They had last seen her leaving the club just before 3 a.m. She had said she was walking home. None of them had heard from her since. Kevin sat with that information for a moment. This wasn't like Sian. That thought, simple and quiet, was the one that changed everything. Because Kevin knew her. He knew that Sian was the person who checked in, who sent the message to say she had arrived safely, who never let the people she loved sit in unnecessary worry. Going silent through the night, staying out without a word, it wasn't something she did. It wasn't who she was. He called the police. The missing person report was filed at 9:45 a.m. on the 19th of March. Kevin gave them everything he had. The name of the club, the time she had left, the route she would have taken, the last time her phone had rung before going to voicemail. What he didn't know yet, what none of them knew yet, was that Sian's phone had emitted one final signal at 3:24 a.m. the previous night. A single ping from the cell network, lasting only seconds before cutting out entirely. The GPS coordinates attached to that signal didn't point to their apartment. They didn't point to the town center or to any point along the route home. They pointed to Savernake Forest, a vast, dense stretch of ancient woodland on the edge of Wiltshire. Remote, quiet, nearly 12 miles from the nightclub where Sian had been standing just 32 minutes earlier. 12 miles and 32 minutes. On foot, that was not possible. Whatever had happened to Sian O'Callaghan had happened fast, and it had happened close. And someone had moved her a long way from the place where she disappeared before her phone had the chance to tell anyone where she was. The investigation that followed would become one of the most significant criminal cases in modern British history. But on that gray Saturday morning, with the town still slow and quiet around him, Kevin Reap sat in an apartment that felt suddenly and terrifyingly empty, and waited for news that was taking far too long to come. Detective Superintendent Steve Fulture had spent over 2 decades in policing. He had worked serious cases before. He knew how the first hours of a missing person investigation felt: the controlled urgency, the careful management of what you knew against what you feared. But something about this one settled differently. Within hours of the missing person report being filed, Fulture had assembled a full dedicated unit. Missing persons officers, surveillance analysts, forensic specialists. The question they were all working backward from was the same one Kevin had been sitting with since 7 a.m. Where did she go? The CCTV network became their primary tool. Officers moved methodically through the town center, entering every business along and around the route Sian would have walked, requesting overnight footage and logging timestamps. By late morning, they had a near-complete picture of her final movements, right up until the moment that picture simply ended. One camera caught her clearly. She was on the pavement, coat on, moving at a calm and steady pace away from the town center. She looked like someone walking home. Nothing more than that. The next camera in the sequence, positioned a short distance further along the same road, showed nothing. An empty street. No Sian. No disturbance. No sign that anything had occurred. The gap between those two camera positions was not large. In the ordinary movement of an ordinary night, a person walking that stretch should have appeared on both. Sian appeared on one and vanished before the other. 32 minutes later, her phone pinged from a forest 12 miles away. Fulture processed this quietly. A professional composure that, in the private geography of the investigation, masked something more urgent. Because the math didn't work. It had never worked. And what the math pointed toward was not a young woman who had made an unplanned detour. It pointed toward a vehicle. Someone who had known exactly what they were doing and moved quickly. By midday, Fulture stood before cameras in Swindon's town square and addressed the media for the first time. He chose his words with precision. This was being treated as an active threat. The public was urged to come forward with any information. Anyone who had been in the town center in the early hours of March 19th, anyone who had seen anything at all along the route between Suju nightclub and the eastern edge of town, was asked to make contact immediately. What followed was something that spoke to the particular character of Swindon itself. Within hours of the press conference, residents were already at their printers. Sian's photograph appeared on lampposts, in shop windows, taped to bus shelters, and the glass panels of phone boxes. People who had never met her drove in from neighboring towns to join the search. By the end of that first day, nearly 400 volunteers were working alongside police, moving in organized lines through parks, alleyways, and the stretches of open land on the outskirts of town. An anonymous donor posted a reward of £20,000 for information. National news cameras arrived in Swindon and set up in the town square. The story moved quickly up the broadcast schedules. A young woman. A short walk home. A town that couldn't account for what had happened in between. Kevin appeared on camera that evening. He was composed in the way that people are composed when the alternative is too frightening to allow. He spoke directly into the lens and asked, quietly and plainly, for anyone who knew anything to come forward. He still believed, at that point, that there was something to come forward with. That someone had seen her. That she was somewhere and could still be found. Behind the press conferences and the search parties and the growing volume of media attention, Fulture's team was working through a problem that was becoming harder to solve with every passing hour. There were no witnesses. Not a single person who had seen Sian on that stretch of pavement after she left her friends. No physical evidence along the route. No dropped belongings. No signs of a struggle. Nothing that broke the surface of the ordinary. The only solid piece of information they had was a phone signal pointing to a forest, and the phone had been silent for nearly 24 hours. The town held itself in an anxious suspension. People spoke about it in hushed voices in shops and cafes and at kitchen tables. The kind of collective unease that settles over a community when something has happened that its understanding of itself doesn't have room for. Swindon was not supposed to be a place where things like this happened. And with every hour that passed without an answer, that assumption became harder to hold. 3 days into the investigation, a surveillance analyst working through hours of overnight traffic footage stopped the playback and leaned closer to the screen. A dark-colored Toyota was moving slowly through the streets near the last known position of Sian's phone signal. Not passing through. moving slowly, deliberately slowly, in the way a vehicle moves when the person inside is looking for something or watching for something. The timestamp placed the vehicle in that location at 3:07 a.m. on the 19th of March, 17 minutes after Sian had left the nightclub. 17 minutes in which she had walked calmly away from her friends and then ceased to appear on any subsequent camera. The analyst flagged the footage. On the recording, the Toyota slows almost to a stop near the edge of the pavement. It remains there for several seconds. Then it pulls away and moves east in the direction of Savernake Forest. Officers ran the registration plate. The vehicle was registered to Christopher Halliwell, 47 years old, a resident of Swindon, licensed taxi driver. Detectives pulled his records. On paper, Halliwell was unremarkable to the point of invisibility. He had a partner, a woman named Heather, and 3 sons. He worked night shifts. He had lived in Swindon for years. His criminal record contained only minor infractions, nothing violent, nothing that should have made anyone look twice. His neighbors described him as quiet. His colleagues described him as dependable. The picture that emerged from those early inquiries was of an average man in his late 40s, doing an ordinary job, living an ordinary life in the same town where Sian O'Callaghan had grown up. Police brought him in for questioning. Halliwell sat across from detectives and answered their initial questions with a steadiness that appeared, on the surface, entirely reasonable. He had been working that night, he said. He had finished his shift at around 1:30 in the morning and driven home. That was all. He hadn't been near the town center after that. He had gone to bed. The detectives listened. Then they showed him the footage. The silence that followed lasted longer than it should have. Halliwell's account began to shift. Small movements at first, a time adjusted here, a detail softened there. Then, under continued questioning, he offered a new explanation. He might have driven through that area after his shift. It was possible. He sometimes took different routes home. It didn't mean anything. The detectives noted every inconsistency. They logged every contradiction between what he said and what the footage showed. But there was nothing physical. Nothing of Sian's had been found in his car. No forensic evidence placing her in the vehicle. No grounds, under the law, to hold him. Christopher Halliwell walked out of the police station on a gray Swindon afternoon and drove himself home. Fulture watched him go and felt something in the case crystallize. He couldn't name it precisely. It was the kind of certainty that comes not from evidence, but from the accumulation of small wrongnesses, a timeline that shifted, eyes that moved at the wrong moments, an explanation offered not to inform, but to cover. He gave the order for covert surveillance. From the moment Halliwell left the station, he was never alone again. He simply didn't know it. A GPS tracker had been fitted to his Toyota overnight. His phone was being monitored. A surveillance team followed him at a distance through every errand, every drive, every stop. Everything was logged. For the first several days, his routine appeared completely unremarkable. He went to work. He stopped at the petrol station. He did the shopping. He came home. On the surface, it was the life of a man with nothing on his conscience. But the surveillance team began to notice something. He was taking routes he didn't need to take. Small deviations that added minutes to journeys that should have been simple. He was avoiding certain streets. The streets, investigators noted, that corresponded most closely with the route between Suju nightclub and the edge of town. He moved through his daily life with a careful, measured quality. Not the ease of someone who had nothing to hide. The deliberate steadiness of someone who knew they were being watched and was working hard not to show it. The team documented everything and waited. On the morning of March 24th, 6 days after Sian had disappeared, Halliwell left his house and drove to a petrol station. He filled his tank. Then he went back inside the kiosk and purchased a separate container of fuel. His tank was already full. The surveillance team exchanged a look and stayed close. Halliwell drove out of the town center, through the suburbs, and onto a rural road on the outskirts of Swindon. The houses thinned out. The street lighting disappeared. He continued driving until the road narrowed to a single lane bordered by hedgerows and open fields, well beyond the reach of any CCTV network. He stopped the car. From the boot, he removed a bundle, the fabric seat covers from the interior of his Toyota. He carried them to a patch of open ground, laid them out with a deliberateness that suggested he had thought about this moment, opened the fuel container, and began to pour. The surveillance team filmed every second from a distance. He struck a match. The covers caught immediately. The flames moved fast in the dry air, consuming the fabric in a matter of minutes. Halliwell stood and watched until there was nothing left but ash and a dark circle on the ground. Then he got back into his car and drove toward the supermarket as though he had simply been running errands. There is no innocent explanation for a man who purchases fuel specifically to burn the seat covers from his car. There is no version of that sequence of events that doesn't mean what it means. The arrest order came through immediately. Christopher Halliwell was taken into custody in the supermarket car park less than an hour after the burning. He didn't resist. He stood beside his car and let the officers approach and made no sudden movements and said very little. When they told him he was being arrested in connection with the disappearance of Sian O'Callaghan, something passed across his face. Not surprise. Something older and more complicated than surprise. He said he had simply been changing out his upholstery. He was placed in a vehicle and the door was closed and Swindon moved past the windows as they drove. Fulture sat across from him. He was aware of what the rules required. He was aware that Halliwell should be taken to the station, processed formally, provided with legal counsel, interviewed under caution with everything recorded and documented according to procedure. He was also aware that somewhere, possibly not far from where they were sitting, Sian O'Callaghan might still be alive. That every hour that passed inside the machinery of formal procedure was an hour she might not have. That the difference between following the rules and breaking them might be the difference between finding her in time and finding only what remained. Fulture made his decision. He directed the car out of town, away from the station, toward the open countryside. And then he spoke to Halliwell not as a detective conducting a formal interview, but as one human being asking another for the truth. He didn't threaten. He didn't make promises. He spoke plainly and directly about the weight of what Halliwell was carrying and what it would mean to keep carrying it, and what it would mean to put it down. For a long time, the only sound was the road beneath the wheels and the countryside moving past the glass. Then Halliwell said, "I'll take you." The convoy moved east out of Swindon in the late afternoon of March 24th. Police vehicles in a quiet line, moving through the familiar outskirts of town and then beyond them, onto the roads that led into the open Wiltshire countryside. The light was changing. The sky had the particular flat, gray quality of late afternoon in an English March, the kind of light that makes everything look like it's already receding into the past. Halliwell directed them down a narrow rural track that pressed into the edge of Savernake Forest. Ancient trees on either side. The ground soft underfoot from days of rain. No sound except the movement of the team and the wind in the upper branches. He pointed to a patch of ground beside the track. It looked like nothing. Fallen leaves. Dark soil. The kind of unremarkable ground that exists in its thousands across the English countryside. Nothing to catch the eye. Nothing to suggest that anything had ever happened here. Forensic teams moved in and sealed the area. Portable lights were erected against the failing afternoon. The work began. Careful, methodical, unhurried despite the urgency. Removing the earth layer by layer to preserve whatever evidence lay beneath. After several hours, they found her. Sian O'Callaghan was 22 years old. She had left a nightclub 10 minutes from her home, and she had never made it back. She had been tucking her little brother Aidan in at night since he was old enough to be afraid of the dark. She had kept a handwritten sign on her desk at work that said, "Keep smiling." She had been planning a future with Kevin in the apartment they shared just outside the town center. The forensic examination confirmed that she had been struck from behind with considerable force. She had most likely lost consciousness almost immediately. She had not suffered long. The team worked without speaking. Fulture stood apart from the others. He had been in this work for over 20 years. He had seen difficult things. But there is a particular quality to a moment like this one. The discovery of someone who was alive and loved and entirely ordinary just days before. That doesn't become easier with experience. It simply becomes something you carry differently. He was still standing there, quietly, when Halliwell spoke again. The words were quiet, almost casual in their delivery, as though he were mentioning something he had nearly forgotten. "There's another one." He didn't give a name. He didn't offer details. He said only that it had happened a long time ago, and that she was close. Forensic teams began searching the surrounding area. A few hundred yards from where Sian had been found, they uncovered a second set of remains. Bones and fragments of clothing, partially decomposed, buried at a similar depth in the same forest floor. DNA testing confirmed the identity. Rebecca Godden, 20 years old. She had disappeared from Swindon 8 years earlier, in 2003. At the time, her disappearance had not triggered a major investigation. Rebecca had been struggling with addiction, with instability, with the kind of invisible life that falls through the gaps of official attention. It had been assumed she had simply moved on, drifted somewhere else. Her mother Karen had never believed that. For 8 years, she had searched and asked and refused to accept an explanation that felt like an excuse. For 8 years, she had lived in the particular torment of not knowing, which is its own kind of grief, formless and unending, because there is nothing to bury and nothing to mark, and the loss never becomes solid enough to mourn properly. Now police were calling her. They had found Rebecca. What investigators were confronting was no longer a single terrible event. It was a pattern. 2 women, years apart, from the same town, buried in the same forest by the same man. A man who had moved through Swindon for years, driving his taxi, doing his shopping, living alongside the families of the women he had killed, entirely unnoticed.
What I can tell you is that a 47-year-old man from Swindon is in custody, having been arrested for kidnap and 2 murders. The location of 2 bodies have been identified to me by this individual, one of whom has yet to be identified formally, but I'm quite clear is...
The trial of Christopher Halliwell opened at Bristol Crown Court in the autumn of 2012. He entered a plea of not guilty. The proceedings moved through weeks of evidence and testimony. Then, in a sudden reversal that surprised almost no one who had followed the case closely, Halliwell changed his plea. He confessed. On the 19th of October, 2012, he was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 25 years for the murder of Sian O'Callaghan. The case involving Rebecca Godden did not follow the same path. Prosecutors reviewed the confession Halliwell had given to Fulture in the car on that March afternoon and made their determination. Under UK law, a statement obtained without legal counsel present, outside a police station, without formal caution, is inadmissible. The confession that had led them to both women. The confession that had given Karen Edwards 8 years of answers in a single phone call could not be used in a court of law. The case collapsed before it reached trial, and then the spotlight turned on Fulture. An internal investigation was opened. The proceedings were formal and procedurally thorough and arrived at a conclusion that many inside the force had seen coming from the moment Fulture had redirected that car away from the station. He had violated the rules governing investigative procedure. He had obtained a statement unlawfully. He had made a unilateral decision that fell outside every protocol his career had been built on. He received a formal disciplinary warning and was required to resign. 20 years of service ended not with a commendation and a photograph and colleagues gathered in a room to mark the occasion. It ended with paperwork and a formal notification and a door closing behind him for the last time. Fulture left England. He took up work with a private security firm abroad, building a different kind of life in a different kind of place, carrying a case that had cost him everything and that he had never apologized for. The public response was sharp and divided. Legal professionals argued with force and principle. Procedure exists for reasons that are not bureaucratic. The protections afforded to a suspect during questioning, legal representation, formal caution, the right to silence exercised in a controlled environment, are not technical inconveniences. They are the architecture of a just system. When a detective decides that the urgency of a particular moment outweighs those protections, they are not making a heroic exception. They are making a decision that, if extended to its logical conclusion, dismantles the very framework that keeps power accountable. The rule of law is not preserved by the people who follow it only when it is easy. On the other side stood 2 families. Sian's mother spoke publicly about Fulture in terms that left no ambiguity. He had given her the chance to bring her daughter home. He had given her something to bury and a place to return to, and an answer to the question that had kept her awake every night since March. Without him, she said, she did not know when, or whether, she would ever have had that. Karen Edwards said the same about Rebecca. 8 years. 8 years of searching and not knowing and being quietly dismissed and carrying a loss that the world did not fully recognize because there was no body and no verdict and no official confirmation that her daughter was gone. Fulture had ended those 8 years. Whatever the law decided about how he had done it, she would not condemn him for it. In 2016, prosecutors returned to the case. New forensic analysis had produced fresh evidence, DNA material and physical findings recovered from the burial site that had not been available during the original proceedings. Evidence that stood independent of anything Halliwell had said in a car on a March afternoon. The case against Christopher Halliwell for the murder of Rebecca Godden was reopened. The jury heard the evidence. They returned a verdict. Guilty. On the 19th of September, 2016, Christopher Halliwell received a second life sentence. This one carried no minimum term, no possibility of parole. He would not be released. He would grow old in a cell, and he would die there, and the last chapter of his life would be written entirely within those four walls.
It took over 5 years for this momentous day. It has been an extremely painful journey, but today we've received the justice that has felt like an eternity coming for our beautiful little girl, Becky.
Sian O'Callaghan left a nightclub in Swindon at 2:52 in the morning and started walking home through streets she had known her whole life. She was 22 years old. She tucked her little brother in at night. She kept a sign on her desk that said, "Keep smiling." She was building a life, quietly and steadily, in the way that she had always done everything. She never made it home. Rebecca Godden had disappeared 8 years before Sian's name was ever known to investigators. She had been young and vulnerable and living at the edges of visibility, and when she was gone, the world had largely looked away. Her mother had not. But one woman searching alone is no match for a town that has already decided an absence is an explanation. Christopher Halliwell moved through Swindon for years after Rebecca was gone and years before Sian disappeared, driving his taxi down familiar streets, stopping at familiar places, living a life that looked, from every angle available to the people around him, entirely ordinary. That is perhaps the most disturbing part of this story. Not the violence, though the violence was real and devastating, but the ordinariness. The way a person can occupy space in a community can be described by neighbors as quiet, by colleagues as dependable, while carrying something that, if known, would make every one of those ordinary interactions impossible to look back on without a chill. Steve Fulture broke the rules. That is not in dispute. He made a unilateral decision in the front of a car on a March afternoon that fell outside every protocol that had governed his career. And in doing so, he found two women who might otherwise have remained in the ground for years longer or forever. Both of those things are true. Neither cancels the other out. The law decided what it decided. Fulture accepted the consequence without public bitterness, without appeals to his own righteousness, without requesting that the system bend its principles on his behalf. He had made his choice with full awareness of what it might cost, and when the cost arrived, he paid it. What he left behind was two families who knew the truth. Two sets of remains returned from a forest floor to the people who had loved them. Two cases closed, eventually, with verdicts that named what had happened and held the person who had done it accountable. Whether that was worth the price is a question that does not have a clean answer. It probably never will. What remains, after the trials, after the sentencing, after the cameras moved on and the flowers outside the nightclub faded and Swindon returned to its ordinary rhythm, is the memory of a young woman who wanted simple things and deserved to have them. Her name was Sian O'Callaghan. She was 22 years old, and she should have made it home. This story is based on the real case of Sian O'Callaghan, who disappeared in Swindon, England in March 2011. Her killer, Christopher Halliwell, was convicted in 2012 for her murder and in 2016 for the murder of Becky Godden.